A quiet suburb just outside Chicago becomes the epicenter of a global reverie, not for politics or sports, but for faith, history, and identity. Why did Dolton decide to buy Pope Leo XIV's childhood home? What does this humble brick house tell us about community, legacy, and spiritual belonging? Imagine strolling down a familiar residential street and suddenly realizing you're standing before a ripple in history. A modest single-family home whose walls once sheltered a boy who would become the first American pope. That boy, Robert Francis Prevost, would grow to lead the world's 1.3 billion Catholics. And now, nearly 2 decades later, his hometown is stepping forward to preserve its memory in stone and story. What does a town gain when it claims a pope's origin? For Dolton's leaders, this isn't about nationalism or tourism. It's about recognizing that greatness often grows from the roots of ordinary places. The decision to buy reflects pride, hope, and a desire to define a collective identity anchored in faith, service, and cultural memory. On a crisp spring morning in Dolton, village trustees voted unanimously to acquire the Prevost family home. The initiative wasn't spontaneous. It was born from years of grassroots momentum. At first, historic preservation societies had canvassed for petitions. Local church leaders organized prayer vigils and fundraisers, and teachers incorporated Pope Leo XIV's story into school curriculums. Each effort added weight until last month's vote became a symbolic tipping point. The press that morning buzzed as cameras followed officials measuring walls, walking hallways, and recounting anecdotes from Robert's childhood. "He learned Latin prayers at that table," said Pastor Elaine Ramirez, recalling the living room where 6-year-old Robbie began his journey to the altar. Those simple memories, shared with reporters, crystallized into collective testimony, Dolton's past reaching out to touch a broader future. Mayor Jamal Thompson described the purchase as a gift to future generations. "This house is more than bricks, it's a vessel of hope." He plans to convert it into a heritage center where students, tourists, and pilgrims can connect with the trajectory of an extraordinary life. It will include original photos, school records, and a corner devoted to multicultural influences, Italian, French, Spanish, Louisiana Creole, that shaped Prevost's worldview. This first part of our story sets the scene, from the vote that sealed Dolton's decision to the early efforts that built momentum. It shows us that buying a pope's childhood home is more than a civic investment. It's an act of spiritual reclamation. It's saying, from this modest house came service to the world. But motivations can stir mixed feelings. Some residents expressed concern about costs and diverts from local needs. "I love the symbolism," admitted Councilman Richard Owens, "but we also need better roads and senior services." Balancing pride and practicality became part of the emotional choreography in Dolton's town halls. Still, efforts inside the community prevailed. Middle school students wrote letters encouraging support. Local businesses pledged donations for restoration. Catholic parishes raised funds and provided volunteers, all converging on one question: can a small house carry big meaning? In the next part, we'll explore the behind the scenes, how the deal was negotiated, who championed the cause, and what the agreement entails. We'll meet the key players, from archivists preserving family heirlooms to community organizers rallying post-online petitions. We'll see how personal devotion and civic duty collided to bring Pope Leo XIV's childhood home back into local hands. When the decision to purchase Pope Leo XIV's childhood home became official, it marked the end of a long, determined journey involving both local government and passionate citizens. Behind the headlines and celebratory quotes was a detailed process, part political negotiation, part grassroots advocacy, and part spiritual calling. The house on Dobson Street was never just real estate. It was memory preserved, mission activated. The movement began subtly, nearly 2 years before the official vote. It started with parishioners from St. Mary of the Assumption Parish who had kept in touch with their former altar boy turned bishop, then cardinal. As his rise within the church gained international attention, especially after his appointment to the Vatican's dicastery for bishops, many in Dolton realized the gravity of the connection. A quiet house in their community had once housed a future pope, perhaps the only pope their country would see in a generation. Initially, community interest was informal. Neighbors reminisced at church picnics. Teachers included Pope Leo XIV in classroom discussions. Youth groups walked by the home on field trips. Then, when Prevost was elected Pope in March 2025, momentum surged. Local papers ran features on Dolton's most famous son. News outlets parked vans outside the residence, hoping to catch photos of visiting pilgrims or reflective neighbors. That attention sparked action. A local history teacher, Carla Jennings, spearheaded a Facebook group titled "Preserve Pope Leo's Legacy." The group, originally intended to gather anecdotes and photos, quickly gained thousands of followers. Within weeks, it became a hub for community coordination. They began lobbying village officials, fundraising online, and contacting historical preservation experts. Simultaneously, officials in Dolton began receiving inquiries from outside parties, including Catholic organizations and media networks interested in purchasing or leasing the house. Fearing the property might fall into private hands and become commercialized or distorted from its humble roots, the village board began quietly evaluating its options. The current owners of the house, an elderly couple who had purchased it decades ago, were surprised but supportive. They shared warm memories of Robbie Prevost, still visible in faded pencil marks on a kitchen wall where he had once charted his height as a boy. Though approached by private collectors with higher bids, the couple chose to sell to the village, citing a desire to see the house become something good for the community. The purchase agreement included provisions for preservation, education, and community access. Village officials promised to maintain the home's original structure as closely as possible, while converting its interior into a small museum and reflection space. Funding was allocated from a combination of village cultural grants, donations from religious groups, and private sponsors, including a generous endowment from the Archdiocese of Chicago. A group of architectural historians was brought in to assess the home. Though small and modest, it had retained many original features, including hardwood floors, a basement laundry room where young Robert once helped his mother, and the small second-floor bedroom where he prayed at night by a window facing St. Mary's Bell Tower. As part of the restoration plan, community members were invited to donate items related to Pope Leo's early life. A neighbor contributed a photo of Robert and his brothers building a treehouse. A retired music teacher donated a hymnal he had once used in choir practice. Even Robert's high school math teacher submitted an old class project, an essay titled "The World Needs Quiet Leaders." The home's transformation wasn't simply physical. It became a spiritual and civic focal point. Churches began organizing prayer walks around the property. High school seniors volunteered to help restore the garden. Artists submitted designs for stained glass panels featuring scenes from Pope Leo's life to be displayed in the small sunroom turned meditation space. While the project inspired excitement, it also prompted introspection. Town meetings buzzed with questions. Would this truly serve Dolton's long-term needs? Was the investment in heritage worth it? How would the space be used? Village trustees emphasized that the purchase wasn't just about honoring the past, but creating a space for learning, dialogue, and interfaith collaboration. The house would host educational tours, retreats for youth leaders, and intergenerational discussions about faith and service. Plans included a scholarship in Pope Leo's name for students pursuing theology or social work, and a digital archive accessible to researchers and schools worldwide. Still, the most powerful moments happened in whispers, not press releases. During one tour before renovations began, a mother lit a small candle in the front room and whispered a prayer for her son, recently deployed overseas. Another man, who had left the church years ago, said visiting the house helped him rediscover a piece of grace I thought I lost. Even Dolton's mayor admitted to moments of quiet awe. "There's a spirit in this house," he told a reporter. Not ghostly, just something deeper, like the walls remember prayers. Media coverage resumed, this time with a tone of reverence. The Associated Press highlighted the town's efforts under the headline, "Dolton Buys Pope's Boyhood Home Finds Itself." CBS ran a special feature titled "Faith Lives Here," chronicling the transformation from private residence to public heritage site. National Catholic Register praised the initiative as a blueprint for spiritual preservation in modern America. The Vatican itself responded with gratitude. In a rare video message, Pope Leo XIV addressed the people of Dolton directly. You have honored not me, but the God who works quietly in small places. Thank you for remembering where I began, and for reminding the world where love begins. The words resonated far beyond Dolton. Faith communities in other towns began exploring similar projects, purchasing old convents, restoring mission chapels, or turning religious homes into shelters and education centers. What started as one home purchase evolved into a national conversation about memory, meaning, and the sacred hidden in the everyday. In the next chapter, we'll explore the cultural and spiritual symbolism this home now carries, not just as a monument to Pope Leo XIV's humble beginnings, but as a beacon for how places of faith can become centers of transformation for generations to come. The house that once sheltered a future pope is now more than a point on a map. It has become a living monument, a space where the sacred and the ordinary blend into something enduring. As Dolton moved forward with the transformation of Pope Leo XIV's childhood home, the conversation shifted from how the house was acquired to what it means. The home became a mirror reflecting Dolton's soul, a vessel for memory, reverence, and cultural healing. Heritage preservation often conjures images of plaques and tours, but in this case, it's also about spiritual stewardship. The decision to protect this small, unassuming home marked a rare intersection of civic pride and transcendent meaning. In a time when historical memory is often politicized or ignored, Dolton offered a different path: to preserve, not to glorify, to remember, not to rewrite. Architectural conservators began their work by cataloguing every detail: the grain of the front door, the arch of the kitchen entryway, the height of the windowsills. Every corner told a story. The staircase creaked in the same way it did when Robert tiptoed up to bed. The closet in his room still held a faint trace of incense from the portable altar he built as a boy. These quiet imprints, lovingly preserved, formed the backdrop of a new narrative, one that invited visitors not just to observe, but to feel. The heart of the home was designated the Room of Origins. Here, a single candle burns before a simple altar. A wooden cross hangs on the wall, flanked by framed handwritten prayers from visitors around the world. There are no glass cases or velvet ropes, just presence. Guests are encouraged to sit, reflect, and listen. Some write letters to Pope Leo, others simply sit in silence. Upstairs, the legacy corridor traces the arc of his life, from boyhood altar server to global shepherd. Exhibits include scanned pages from his math homework, his first seminary ID, photos of him in Peru, and excerpts from his early homilies. But the exhibit avoids hagiography. Instead, it emphasizes his humanity, his doubts, his questions, his mistakes. A quote from one of his letters is etched into the wall: "Holiness is not perfection, but persistence in love." The backyard garden, once overgrown, was transformed into a circle of blessing, a space designed by local students featuring a walking path, native flowers, and stones engraved with the names of Dolton residents who contributed to the project. The centerpiece is a statue of Mary, modeled after the one young Robert would kneel before at St. Mary's Parish. At night, string lights illuminate the space, and on weekends, local choirs gather to sing hymns under the stars. As the site opened to the public, its deeper purpose became evident. It wasn't about museum traffic, it was about spiritual encounter. Pilgrims from across the US began arriving in quiet reverence. Families brought children to show them where faith and service begin. Veterans came to pay respect to a fellow servant. Even non-Catholics walked away moved, often surprised at how such a small place could stir something so universal. "I expected a house," said one visitor from Oregon. "What I found was a sanctuary." Schools started incorporating field trips to the home as part of their ethics and civics programs. Students wrote essays about what it means to live for something bigger than oneself. One third grader, in an entry that made local news, wrote, "He wasn't rich or famous when he lived here, but he believed in kindness. Maybe I can too." The home also became a space of reconciliation. A local interfaith group hosted a vigil there in memory of lives lost to violence in Chicago. Leaders from Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and secular communities came together, reading prayers in multiple languages. The gathering ended with the lighting of a single flame in the Room of Origins, a moment of unity in a fragmented world. For many, the home offered healing. Survivors of trauma, former prisoners, grieving families, all found comfort in the simplicity of the space. It became a place where tears could fall without judgment, where silence felt holy. A social worker described it as the kind of sacred space that reminds you you're not alone. Media coverage began reflecting this spiritual atmosphere. Articles shifted from celebratory to contemplative. Instead of headlines about the Pope, journalists wrote about hope, memory, and redemption. CBS returned for a follow-up special titled The House That Heals, featuring testimonies from visitors whose lives were touched by the experience. The transformation even inspired other towns. In Kansas, a group of parishioners bought the childhood home of a missionary nun and turned it into a tutoring center. In Detroit, a historic black church launched a campaign to preserve its 1905 rectory as a space for dialogue and justice. Dolton had sparked a movement, not through spectacle, but through sincerity. Amid all this, the home remained tethered to its original purpose, to honor the journey of a soul shaped by family, faith, and community. Pope Leo XIV's own reflections, shared through letters and occasional video messages, reminded visitors not to venerate the house, but to internalize its message. In one letter, now framed in the living room, he wrote, "I remember the scent of my mother's library books, the hum of my father's radio, the echo of the church bell. I remember doubts whispered into my pillow and prayers shouted into the sky. This house taught me to love before I understood theology. I hope it teaches you something too." This deeper narrative, the intertwining of personal story and public faith, resonated especially with young people. Youth groups began organizing retreats around the home. Instead of lectures, they shared personal stories of loss and hope, faith and struggle. The home became a place where spiritual inheritance felt real and attainable. Perhaps the most powerful moment came during a silent retreat held on the first anniversary of the house's opening. 100 people gathered at dusk. No speeches were given. Candles were lit in each room. In the backyard, a single violin played. No one spoke. It was as if the house itself had found its voice in the quiet, one of grace, of memory, of the sacred woven into the everyday. As the sun rose that morning, the first visitor was a teenager from Dolton. She carried no phone, took no photos. She walked through the rooms, sat in the garden, and when asked why she came, she simply said, "I just wanted to know what faith looked like before it got famous." In Part 4, we'll turn our lens toward the voices of Dolton itself, the neighbors, shopkeepers, students, and clergy who have lived through this transformation. How has the community changed, and what does it hope to become? From skepticism to celebration, their stories reveal the profound and often surprising ways this home continues to shape hearts. As the home on Dobson Street opened its doors to the world, the most profound changes were unfolding quietly within Dolton itself. This modest town, once overlooked in broader conversations about history or heritage, was now experiencing a collective shift in identity. Longtime residents, young students, local business owners, and pastors each began seeing their community with new eyes, not through the lens of nostalgia, but through the energy of rediscovery. One of the first to feel the impact was 78-year-old Dolores Mendez, who had lived across the street for nearly 5 decades. She remembered watching Robert Prevost ride his bike on summer afternoons, pausing to wave before heading to choir practice. Now, she stood at her window each morning watching pilgrims arrive from different states. "I used to think nothing ever happened here," she said, "but now it feels like the whole world is coming to us." Her sentiment echoed through neighborhood streets. The renewed attention had a tangible ripple effect. Flower beds were cleaned, sidewalks repaved, and murals began appearing. Depictions of community strength, images of Pope Leo XIV as a boy planting seeds, always surrounded by local symbols like the water tower or the St. Mary's bell. Youth groups began organizing monthly cleanup drives, adopting the phrase "Legacy starts local" as their motto. At the public library, librarians curated a new community exhibit titled "From Dolton to Rome," featuring journals, artwork, and letters from residents sharing their memories of Robert Prevost. Children wrote notes imagining what they would do if they were Pope for a day. The exhibit also included photos of current Dolton students volunteering at the heritage site, reinforcing the idea that history isn't just something you study, it's something you build. For Pastor June Carter, leader of a non-denominational church nearby, the transformation carried spiritual weight. She began incorporating the story of Pope Leo into her sermons, not to promote Catholicism, but to teach her congregation about humility, service, and purpose. "This isn't just about religion," she told her flock. "It's about a neighbor who gave his life to love others. We all can do that." Dolton's schools became incubators of reflection. Educators hosted discussions about vocation, character, and leadership. One teacher at Rosa Parks Middle School asked her 8th graders, "What legacy will you leave behind?" Responses were compiled into a class book titled The Next Chapter, now on display at the Heritage Home. Students wrote about kindness, standing up to bullying, and serving their communities. One entry simply read, "I want to be someone who listens when others are hurting, like Robbie did." The Dolton Chamber of Commerce began noticing subtle but meaningful economic shifts. Local diners added specials like the Robbie's Breakfast, and bookstores stocked biographies on Pope Leo XIV. Weekend visitors brought new traffic to Main Street, prompting some businesses to stay open later. It wasn't a tourism boom, but it was enough to spark confidence. "People are talking about Dolton with pride," said Chamber President Angela Reid. "That hasn't happened in years." Among the clergy, the story deepened personal reflection. Father David Chen from St. Mary's began incorporating Pope Leo's childhood anecdotes into catechism classes, reminding students that sainthood often starts in silence and service. During a confirmation ceremony, he asked the youth to reflect not on what they would become, but who they were becoming: honest, loving, humble. He concluded with the words, "God chose this place to grow a shepherd. Let that inspire you to tend to your corner of the world." Even those who had once been skeptical began to soften. George Whitman, a retired mechanic who had publicly criticized the home purchase as sentimental politics, later admitted he'd changed his mind after visiting with his granddaughter. She looked around and said, "Grandpa, this is a good place." And I realized maybe good places matter more than I thought. Community elders saw in this movement a kind of revival. Not just of buildings or events, but of belief in one another, in the power of story, in the quiet dignity of remembering well. Local newspaper editorials began featuring first-person reflections on healing, forgiveness, and hope. "The house reminds us we are more than our mistakes," read one op-ed. "It tells us that love leaves footprints even when we forget." Choirs from various churches collaborated on a concert titled Roots and Wings, held in the backyard of the home. They sang hymns, spirituals, and original compositions. The final piece, written by a local teenager, was called Where Grace Begins. Audience members held candles as voices rose into the night, echoing through the streets where Robbie once played. Some of the most touching changes were quiet. A man who hadn't been to church in 20 years stood outside the house for an hour before walking to confession. A widow who lost her son to violence returned with a bouquet and left a note that read, "He would have liked this place." Teenagers brought their journals and sat on the steps just to write. A boy with autism visited every Saturday and left hand-drawn cards that staff displayed on the kitchen wall. Dolton had not only preserved a house, it had awakened a story that belonged to everyone. It was not just about the Pope, but about what happens when a community claims its history with humility and purpose. It reminded people that greatness doesn't come from grand entrances, but from faithful, ordinary footsteps. As seasons changed, so did the rhythms of town life. But the house remained steady. Its lights glowed warmly in the evening, its doors stayed open to strangers, and its silence, rich with memory, continued to invite a new kind of listening. In Part 5, we look beyond Dolton to the national and global response. From pilgrims arriving from across the country to international press and church leaders citing Dolton as a symbol of spiritual heritage, the story of one small home continues to echo far and wide. The significance of Dolton's decision to purchase and preserve Pope Leo XIV's childhood home did not remain contained within the village limits. As news of the project spread, waves of attention, inspiration, and dialogue began to ripple across the nation and even around the world. What began as a local act of preservation quickly became a symbol of deeper truths about origin, belonging, and the hidden power of the everyday. Religious leaders from across denominations took notice. Catholic bishops praised Dolton's initiative during regional synods, calling it an example of how communities can reclaim sacred memory with dignity. Protestant pastors, Jewish rabbis, and Muslim imams echoed similar sentiments, noting that the story transcended doctrine and spoke instead to something universal, the human yearning to be rooted in stories of hope, humility, and purpose. In media circles, the tone shifted from curiosity to reverence. National broadcasts covered not just the heritage home itself, but its transformative effect on Dolton's civic life. Reporters interviewed teenagers who said they felt proud to be from somewhere with a story worth telling. Editorials praised the village for seeing the potential in a house, rather than waiting for outsiders to define its value. Pilgrims arrived steadily, some from distant corners of the US, others from Latin America, Europe, and Asia. A group of seminarians from Argentina included Dolton in their US study tour. A Peruvian family drove from New Jersey just to kneel on the grass outside the house and sing hymns they remembered from Chiclayo. A bishop from Nigeria visited unannounced, left a rosary on the porch and departed without fanfare. What struck many visitors most was the home's ordinariness. Unlike the grandeur of Rome or the stateliness of major cathedrals, this house had nothing to prove. Its simplicity spoke volumes. The narrow stairwell, the creaky floors, the handwritten prayer wall, these became sacred not because they were rare, but because they were real. People felt something ancient and urgent. That sanctity doesn't require spectacle. Journalists began drawing parallels with other global faith sites, the birthplace of St. Teresa of Calcutta, the small shrine in Assisi where St. Francis heard his call, the dirt-floored chapel in Uganda where martyrs once sang. In this lineage of sacred places born of simplicity, Dolton's house earned its quiet place. Academics, too, were intrigued. Theology departments launched research projects exploring place theology, how environments shape spiritual identity. Cultural historians analyzed the house as a contemporary model for community-led heritage work. Urban planners asked how cities might integrate sacred storytelling into neighborhood design. But perhaps the most profound responses were private. A woman from Los Angeles who had left the church decades earlier described her visit as a kind of healing I didn't expect. A man who'd lost his faith said he didn't leave with all his questions answered, but he left feeling seen by God for the first time in years. Faith communities outside Catholicism embraced the story with unexpected warmth. An imam from Minneapolis gave a Friday sermon about Pope Leo XIV's roots, encouraging youth to honor their parents and community. A Buddhist monk in Oregon shared the story during a retreat on compassion, describing the house as a monument to humble beginnings. Non-religious visitors found meaning too. An agnostic filmmaker called it a study in human scale. A group of young activists said the project reminded them that social impact doesn't require global platforms, just attention to the ground beneath one's feet. Meanwhile, Pope Leo XIV, though careful not to allow personal veneration, expressed gratitude. In private messages shared through his representatives, he emphasized that the home belonged not to him, but to every child growing up in unnoticed corners of the world, dreaming quietly, living faithfully. "Let this house remind the world," he wrote, "that every street, every school, every table has the potential to shape a soul meant to serve others." His message resonated with educators, community organizers, and people of conscience worldwide. It became a rallying cry for those working in overlooked neighborhoods, rural parishes, and struggling cities. Dolton's example offered a kind of hope rarely seen on newsstands, a reminder that holiness begins with attention. Over time, other towns began following suit. In New Orleans, a Creole community restored the former home of a black Catholic nun as a spiritual library. In El Paso, a migrant center converted a defunct bus station into a house of prayer. Dolton had not just preserved a building, it had awakened a movement. Not institutional, not orchestrated, but quietly alive. Back in Dolton, local leaders continued their work without ceremony. Volunteers swept leaves from the sidewalk. Retired carpenters repaired shutters. Teens updated the digital archive with new visitor testimonies. The home remained what it always had been, a place where the sacred met the ordinary. And though it now appeared in guidebooks and inspired podcasts, the house never lost its heartbeat. A child's drawing hung in the front window. A rosary from Peru rested on the kitchen table. A candle flickered on a windowsill facing the same street where Robbie once ran towards school, unaware of the future waiting for him. For all its national and global recognition, the true impact of the house was always measured locally, in the conversations it sparked, the memories it unearthed, the gentleness it encouraged. It reminded people that their own beginnings mattered, that they didn't need to wait for miracles, that sometimes remembering well is the most radical act of faith. Today, as the sunlight filters through the windows of that quiet home in Dolton, it no longer belongs to just one family or one town. It belongs to all of us who search for meaning in the ordinary. It reminds us that greatness often starts in small rooms, with whispered prayers, shared meals, and footsteps that echo across time, not because they were loud, but because they were faithful. This is what makes the story of Pope Leo XIV's childhood home more than a local curiosity. It's a mirror to our shared humanity, to the roots that shape us and the choices that define us. It's a story of how one community chose to remember, not for nostalgia's sake, but to inspire the present and shape the future. Dolton didn't just preserve a house, it made a promise to tell the story of a boy who grew up to lead not through power, but through service. And in doing so, Dolton offered the world a reminder that sacred places don't have to be ancient cathedrals or grand temples. Sometimes they are right next door. At Think Fresh Daily, we believe in stories like this, stories that connect the past to the present, the local to the global, the humble to the holy, stories that renew our faith in people, place, and purpose. If this story has moved you, challenged you, or made you reflect on your own beginnings, we invite you to walk further with us. There are more stories ahead, of quiet revolutions, of hidden heroes, of sacred spaces waiting to be seen. Subscribe to Think Fresh Daily, and let's continue uncovering the extraordinary within the everyday.